I don't think I do many guest videos, so I figured it was about time I did one. Let me introduce you guys to Prophet of Zod. I've known him since last year's Faithless Forum. That's where we met. By the way, the next Faithless Forum is officially announced now, April 27th in Dallas, Texas. You guys can go to faithlessforum.com to get tickets, to look up the address or times or whatever else you need. I'm gonna be there, Cosmic Skeptic, Rachel Oates, Holy Kool-Aid, Genetically Modified Skeptic, and lots of others. So if you guys want to meet us, then be there. Or be square. And trust me, nobody wants to be square. Circular is a much better shape. Anyways, that's where I met Zod. He's a really good dude, and you guys should definitely check out his channel, which is in the description. Okay, let's get into it.
Hi, my name's Prophet of Zod. I think Telltale already explained who I am and what I'm doing here, so I'll forgo self-introductions, except to say that it's a great honor to be here and all that, which it is, and just get right into a story about something awkward that happened to me last summer. Good way to use a guest spot on someone else's channel, huh? So anyway, you know how sometimes you're just walking around minding your own business when all of a sudden you run into a shaman? And before you know it, you're hearing a story about how mountains and trees talk to people or something? And of course at first you think the shaman's just using a figure of speech for how it feels when you're out in nature or whatever. But then suddenly it hits you the person's being totally serious and, thinks they're like an actual magical shaman, and the mountains and trees literally talk to them. And then you feel a little awkward because, wait, what? You haven't? Huh, well I guess that wasn't a fantastic point of reference then. Whatever. So yeah, this is actually a true story. Last summer, my youngest son and I were exploring mock-ups of different traditional native houses behind the Alaska Native Heritage Center. We live in Alaska, by the way. And in one of them, we were greeted by a member of the tribe who, as in many of the houses, was on hand to tell us both about the structure's various features and of the artifacts that were set up inside. As she went on with related information about her tribal culture, she started telling us about how everything in the world talks to us. The mountains talk to us, the grass and trees talk to us, the waters talk to us, and so on. You get the idea. And while I thought she was being symbolic, it turns out she most certainly was not. Because toward the end of the presentation, she revealed that she was an Inupiat shaman and that she had recently received a message from a mountain. Now the first thing I did was think, that's weird. And the second thing I did was look around at the other visitors who were there listening, which is when I noticed something that struck me as even weirder. And that is that about a dozen fully functional, well-adjusted adults were just standing there nodding in agreement and asking clarifying questions, in all ways seeming to indicate that they took her seriously. Now, of course I can get playing along to some extent. I mean, even I found myself entering the room as a fairly receptive audience member. I was enjoying a special day with my son, who was very interested in native culture, and I was predisposed to be more sympathetic to this soft-spoken member of a marginalized culture than to a wildly charismatic and manipulative televangelist. But on the other hand, I knew very well that no mountain had ever told her a damn thing in her life. Because let's be real, it's obvious as that mountains don't talk to people, and anybody who thinks they do is being superstitious. And I think that in most situations, most of the other people in the room would find this basic fact to be equally obvious. So why didn't they say so? Well, I guess part of it is they were being polite like I was. But then many of them were showing a level of buy-in that appeared to go way beyond this. So why? I'm sure there's a lot that went into it, but to fully understand the crowd's reaction, we need to go back and look at what she claimed the mountain actually said. See, what she told us, her great mystical revelation, was that the mountain wanted the U.S. military to clean toxic waste it had left behind on some tribal land. Now this really completes the picture, doesn't it? Once we discover what she said, it becomes clear that nobody was nodding in agreement because they were learning anything new. Because this message from a mountain was not changing their minds about anything. They were all nodding along because they were hearing a totally non-controversial statement that almost any decent person, at least walking in as a casual listener, would agree with. And I believe that this is what the shaman was going for. When she told people mountains didn't care for toxic waste, she was not using the power of its authority to change their minds. Rather, she was taking a message she knew most people already agreed with and using it to legitimize both the mountain's alleged voice and her role as its messenger. I'm pretty sure she, being at least somewhat used to working crowds, was aware of a couple things. First, that most people who attend a live presentation will be uncomfortable calling the speaker out as a liar, even if it appears to be a scam. And second, by hitching her claim of mountain whispering to such an obviously positive message, she's setting the stage so that anybody who questioned any part of her message would then sound just a teensy bit pro-toxic waste, or at the very least would come off as an overly literal smarty pants shitting on a feel-good message. Because even the average non-superstitious crowd is going to find the quality of a sentiment more compelling than the nitpicky mechanics of how it was arrived at. However, if mountains really spoke and the shaman were actually using its words to effect change, wouldn't she present a message that actually challenged people with new information, an enlightening insight, or a controversial call to action? Why use such mystical powers to convey something so obvious when she could have just told them herself and they'd have agreed anyway? The reason is simple. Instead of using the authority of the mountain to sell a challenging message, she was using an easy message to sell people on the authority of the mountain. Now, to be clear, I don't necessarily think she was doing this on purpose. I had the impression that she believed what she was saying on some level, possibly based on some meditative experience she'd had, and that she was not making a fully calculated decision to deceive people. However, I do think that, on some level, she knew what kind of message would get what reaction from her visitors, and some process somewhere inside her mind sifted through the possibilities and picked a fairly benign sentiment that would be an easy sell. Now, at this point, I could imagine some people saying, fine, so the whole thing is useless bullshit. But if it's useless, isn't it also benign? If the speaker's just trying to appeal to what people already believe, then they don't actually introduce new ideas into the conversation. So there's no harm, right? Well, not exactly. The problem is that messages like these don't necessarily appeal to the best ideas. They appeal to easy ideas. Essentially, these prophecies are like intellectual candy. They take your first inclination, which could be based on anything from thoughtless first impression to sentiment to biases, and once they've hooked you in, they encourage you to stop thinking by pretending that a mystical force has settled the issue. And once the idea of deferring to a divine authority even enters into the equation, you're less susceptible to believing for bad reasons. Now, in the case of the shaman, we were looking at a bunch of tourists who are going to nod and smile, then walk away with a patronizing feeling that they'd honored another culture by giving it 5 minutes of their attention, and it will have little if any effect at all. But that's not always how it works. See, I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and I am very familiar with hearing someone go up front and give a word from the Lord, which may be part of why I was so in tune with the kind of message this shaman gave. And just as she didn't say the mountain wanted all white people to jump into the sea or give the coordinates of a gold deposit, I never heard anybody at my church ever prophesy that a guy was cheating on his wife or that it would rain all week next week. The reason being, of course, that since prophecies aren't literally real, any such message has to, 1. Not require the prophet to produce any information they hadn't come by naturally, and 2. Be easy for people to hear. The result is usually bland encouragement or obvious observations, which have little positive or negative effect on anything. In churches, this usually took the form of the standard, "Thus saith the Lord, you are my beloved people, and I will always care for you," and blah blah blah. But once you've opened the door to the idea that people who prophesy are speaking for God, you've put a dangerous amount of power in their hands and disrupted any intelligent deliberation over why people should or shouldn't do things, especially when you're dealing with a loyal, regularly meeting congregation. It takes little imagination to see how God telling the congregation how very special it is can gradually shift to God telling the congregation it's better than all the depraved sinners in the world, and that they're a city on a hill and need to avoid association with all the corrupt influences around them. And this is literally stuff I've heard, by the way, often in as many words. The fortress building and even cult-creating influences fed by this are obvious. And when you're dealing with a group of isolated conservative fundamentalists, you can only imagine the ideas that fester in this inward-looking cesspool. Thus saith the Lord, for far too long has this wicked generation tolerated the sin of homosexuality. Thus saith the Lord, I call upon you to drive the scourge of abortion from this land, for I will not abide the murder of the young. I really feel the Lord calling the women of this church to walk in submission to their husbands, as husbands walk in submission to Christ. Or, of course, there's this favorite of pastors. The Lord has impressed upon my heart that many in this church are worshiping the idol of materialism, and by withholding their tithes and offerings are robbing God. Of course, you may say that these messages are way worse than a feel-good message about removing toxic waste. But here's the thing. You only decided this by using your mind to evaluate the merits and dangers of each idea. And once you let the idea of prophetic authority into the picture, you're at least flirting with the idea of deferring the very judgment that let you make the distinction. The fact that people like the sound of a message does not always mean it's benign. It can be used to shore up their ugliest inclinations, to legitimize their pre-existing bigotry, to call them to arms against the world when they should be pondering their role in it. It instantly settles complex questions without adequate thought, silencing voices of nuanced deliberation and putting the final authority of God behind those who speak with force and charisma. I've seen this happen. I've seen firsthand the harm that comes from people allowing themselves to think that the words of another human are more than the words of another human. That's why you should never let a person use a positive message to trick you into relaxing your critical thinking skills. And that's why I didn't think it was the least bit cute when the shaman told everybody she'd spoken to a mountain.
That's all I've got for you. Thanks again to Prophet of Zod for coming on. Fascinating story. I probably would have spent some time deprogramming aforementioned Shaman. Don't forget to check out Zod's channel and check me out on Patreon. That's how I manage to keep doing what I do. So if you guys like what I do and you want to support my work, then check me out there. All links are in the description as always. Thanks for watching, guys.